You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deeper waters.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host, seeking to bring you the very best in Christian scholarship and apologetics. And today, we're going to make history, because we're going to be talking about history. We're talking about how history is done, and especially in the area of the New Testament, because this is such a controversial area, and it's that way for Christians and non-Christians both. And we need someone to guide us in this area. And the person I've brought on is someone that Mike Lacona recommended to me. Her name is Beth Sheppard. She holds a PhD in New Testament Studies from the University of Sheffield and serves as the director of the Duke Divinity School Library and also teaches New Testament courses. Her research interests include not only library administration and practice, but also the fourth gospel. She is particularly intrigued by the ins and outs of everyday life for early Christians. Her dual research agenda is reflected in the diversity of journals in which her recent articles have appeared, including Theological Librarianship and Sapientia Logos. She has written a book entitled The Craft of History for the Study of the New Testament, which is what we are going to be talking about today. Prior to coming to Duke, Sheppard directed the library and taught New Testament courses at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Although a United Methodist layperson, Sheppard has pastored in rural United Methodist congregations and continues to preach and teach in church settings when called upon to do so. Her orientation towards service is also present in her work in the Academy, where she is a member of the editorial team for the European Studies on Christian Origins series, published by Continuum. Dr. Sheppard, welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast.
Thank you very much, Nick. You're most gracious to invite me to participate on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
We'll send some things to Mike afterwards, because he's the one who recommended you.
All right.
Well, if my audience doesn't know much about you, how is it that you got to be doing what you're doing?
Oh, well, I have a very long history of love for the Bible. I began in undergraduate taking a religion and classical Greek degree, and the very first thing they made me translate once I got in Upper Greek was the prologue of the Gospel of John, and from that time on, I've been hooked on working with the Gospels and trying to figure out more about my faith and the faith of others. It's just always been a joyful journey. Mm-hmm. I ended up going to Princeton Theological Seminary to get a Master's of Divinity degree, where I focused on New Testament as my master's degree subject. And at Sheffield, I ended up traveling to Sheffield, which is in England, with my husband, who was studying at the same time in the history department. And oddly enough, since he was in the history department and I was in the Bible department, the history department there, of course, he had fellow students who were studying a little bit of everything. They would study things like, World War II and the history of the British Isles and that sort of thing. But oddly enough, he would come back and talk to me about this course he had called historiography, or it was basically how to do history. And what he was learning in the course and the scholars he was reading had no bearing on what I was learning and doing in biblical studies. And I kept asking myself, why is he learning all of this stuff about how to do history professionally as a history PhD student? And we're not learning the same thing in the biblical studies department. Mm-hmm. So When I got back to the United States, I was working on a library degree because I ended up landing and working in a library even though I had my doctorate in Bible. And I had a chance at library school to take a course at Emporia State University in Kansas in their Department of History. And so I chose to take the historiography course there. And I got to read and learn about the discipline of having to do history. And so in a way, my book, Craft of History, is just my way of exploring what would it mean to apply some of the techniques and methods that I learned in those classes, and that people who go and become historians in fields outside of Bible, what would it look to have those approaches applied to Bible. And that's pretty much where I am and what I've done and why I'm interested in the subject.
Yeah, I can tell when you talk about being a librarian and studying library sciences and things of that sort, you're obviously doing the work of God right there.
Yes, it's fun. I actually belong to a group called the American Theological Library Association.
Mm-hmm.
And theological librarianship is a discipline in and of itself. What is the difference, we always ask, between being a regular librarian and a librarian who collects and curates materials about the faith and who makes those materials available to others about the faith? And it's not just about the collection. It's about our whole attitude of service and our understanding that what we're doing is a theological calling.
Mm.
So it's one of the, if I've got time to talk about what the difference might be between a regular librarian. When it comes to professors, at least who are retiring, sometimes schools are very happy to say, goodbye, thank you for contributing 20 years here, but now we need your parking space. By contrast, in theological librarianship, the library steps up at the plate when a professor is retiring and begins to ask, you've got so much, you've studied so much, you've done so much on behalf of your ministry. Is there a way now that we as a library can help you transition into your continued work or the next phase of your work? Mm-hmm. And so we sometimes provide library spaces for faculty emeritus faculty to work. We might provide forums for them to speak and continue to share their knowledge. We might assist them on, as they're moving from their office to off-campus sites, to pare down their library and provide them library access. In short, in a theological library, the pastoral concerns are always foremost in dealing with those who come in our circles. We're not just vending books and checking them out and getting them back. We're actually concerned about the people and the mission.
Yeah, I just know that whenever we moved here, my wife and I have lived in Atlanta for a little over a year. One of the first things I did was find out where is the local library, and I use it extensively.
All right.
Now, I also like to ask you, since you got a PhD in New Testament, that there don't seem to be many female scholars that I see in the field from time to time. We've had Lynn Kelwick on, for instance, but it seems like it's kind of an exception. What's it like being a female scholar in the field?
I think it's a generational thing. When I was working on a master's degree in religious application and arts at Isle School of Theology, where I was for a few years after I finished up at Princeton, I was the only female in the biblical studies department. And when I was at Princeton doing my MDiv, I was given permission to attend and participate in some of the doctoral study courses there. And I was the only female there. But I guess for me, it never really bothered me because I grew up in a small rural community in Pennsylvania and was used to women doing non-typical things. Growing up on a farm, when it starts to rain and the hay has to come in so it doesn't get ruined by the rain, my mother would race out of the house and hop on the tractor, and my dad would be working on the baler, and my sister and I would see both of our parents working to get the crops in. And so gender roles didn't really make much sense to me. The same thing happened with our mail carrier. I went to college and I would talk about our mail lady. Mrs. Dunbar was wonderful and delivered our mail, but that's because Mr. Dunbar actually worked on his farm during the day, and so Mrs. Dunbar carried the mail to our community. So I think it predisposed me to not be taken aback by being the only female in some circumstances or doing things that maybe other women didn't think necessarily to do. So when I was at school, I would do things in Bible and not think twice about it. But there were other female students around in Christian education or in other majors. Nowadays, when I look at the doctoral students in seminaries, there's more balance. I know at Duke we have a number of women studying doctorates in the Department of Bible, just as many men, actually, I believe.
Yeah, I remember when my roommate and I, before I got married to Audi, when we moved to Charlotte, it was his mother who came and helped. And they live on a farm in Missouri, and she works really hard. I remember him telling me about some conditions she was having and such. And he said, "So you think you're going to be able to get her to take it easy?" No.
That's it.
Now, when we were talking about historiography and such, I brought up his name before, but I do have one about on page 95 of your book here. You talk about how historiography is coming increasingly into New Testament studies, and you in fact referred to Mike Lacona's book, Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. And I did get in touch with him immediately when I read that. He said, "Yeah, that's how I got in touch with her to begin with." When you read that book, for instance, what struck you as different that showed historiography going on that you weren't used to seeing?
In that book, Mike is very good about understanding that historiography isn't always necessarily done the same way by the same people. That different people have different approaches, and that what has been done in the field of biblical studies, his experience was very much similar to mine. What he learned as a student of history was different from what he was encountering as a student in Bible as well. And he remarked particularly about that break. What I like about Mike's book in particular is that studying history doesn't necessarily, or using methods to study history or using approaches to study history, doesn't necessarily have to damage someone's faith.
Right.
I think there's a difference. Not addressing Mike's book, but this is me here. I think that there's a difference between faith-seeking understanding and using history to understand and broaden a portrait of Jesus, who was somebody who lived and walked the earth, and adding details, and actually having proof. Faith, in a way, is about having some foggy ends where we need to make a leap of faith. Knowledge is actually knowing, and if we knew 100% about the past, we wouldn't have religion as a faith-based thing. We would have knowledge, and at that point, we have knowledge of, say, the chemical composition of, water, H2O, but it doesn't necessarily. It's the leap of knowing that water of our baptism signifies something deeper about our relationship with the divine that makes water an element of faith. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No. We could. I can just picture some skeptics out there saying, "See, there you go. It's all just probable." But this isn't a problem with religious history. Is it? I mean, we have the exact same thing if we were studying the history of the British Isles, like you mentioned, or World War II, or anything else. This is our history, isn't it?
Yes, it is, absolutely. There is, for example, the Doomsday Book from medieval history mentions families and events that occurred in medieval Europe, and there's only one mention of someone's name in the Doomsday Book that is the only knowledge we have of that person from history. Just because we only have that one mention doesn't mean that person never existed. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like the question of, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody sees it, did it still fall? Or if only one person sees it, can we believe that person? Mm-hmm. That's sort of the question we have with the Gospels. We have 4 witnesses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And sometimes the question is, were they even in the forest to hear the tree? If they were in the forest, how can we believe them? Mm-hmm. It's the same with any sort of history, be it the Doomsday Book or the Gospels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now, of course, there are some things in history that, as much as we talk about probable, there are also details that sometimes we say, this is so probable, we don't even dispute it. It's pretty much absolutely certain. No one would say, for instance, where it's probable that Alexander the Great lived. And if you start saying, I'm not sure if Alexander the Great was a real person, most people would probably look, especially in history, and say, you go sit over there, okay, we're having a real discussion here. And I say this because one of the activities I engage in a lot of times when I'm online is dealing with mythicists, the people who say Jesus never even existed. Yes, I must be a masochist in some ways, of sorts. And, I find the standards for proof sometimes people make for arguments in history are absolutely ridiculous, and they wouldn't be used anywhere else for any other figure. But as soon as it's someone religious or something with Jesus, the standards change entirely.
Yes, Nick, you bring up a very good point. I guess the question is, how much evidence is enough? Mm-hmm. When you're thinking about Alexander the Great, there are coins all over the place in the ancient world that archaeologists have found with his figure on them. There are all sorts of archaeological pieces of evidence. There are mentions in texts and literature. When it comes to Jesus, Jesus was essentially, when he began ministering, working. Alexander the Great marched across, continents. By contrast, Jesus was essentially a person who lived and ministered and worked in an area the size of the state of New Jersey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how many of us actually know something about New Jersey's local history and local local heroes, and could even name, for example, who was the mayor of Trenton in 1997.
Oh, that's right on the tip of my tongue here, okay?
Don't get me wrong, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have a relative who lives in Trenton, and as a little child, I would go and visit my relatives in Teaneck, New Jersey, in the area. But I couldn't tell you who was mayor back then. I mean, I was 12 years old and interested in other things. And so, when you look at Jesus and think about him as being a figure who was, when the disciples were following him, he was just their teacher.
Right.
They didn't necessarily know that Christianity was going to, be something of interest for the whole world. I mean, it took the book of Acts for us to see Christianity really starting to spread beyond the region. So, unlike Alexander the Great, where you have lots of evidence, because he was immediately on the world stage by marching across it. Jesus was actually in Israel, which was a little backwater in the empire, working from there, which is amazing and miraculous in its own right, and should be inspiration to us. Right. That Jesus, that God uses not the famous, not the most visual, not the biggest bang, but is able to use the humble and the small and the obscure to move forward God's kingdom.
Yeah, when I talk with people and I say, well, why didn't more contemporary people mention Jesus of a time? And I say, look, he was, in essence, a nobody back in this time. No one in Rome would have cared about him. He was a miracle worker, which would mean he was seen as a huckster, much like the televangelists we see on TV. He never went to battle, never ran for office, never wrote a book, and he was crucified on top of that. It doesn't surprise me so few people mention Jesus. It surprises me anyone at all mentioned him.
Exactly. I mean, that you hit the nail on the head.
I think another great danger that we have is that whenever we kind of have water cooler talk about the New Testament and such, that everyone comes, unfortunately, and the idea of bias is too easy to be thrown around. And both ways it can be thrown. That a Christian can say to someone who's a New Testament scholar, but who's an atheist, and say, well, they have a bias against miracles, so you can't really trust their work. And then a skeptic can look at a Christian and say, yeah, well, they believe the Bible is the Word of God, so you can't really trust their work either.
Well, I think bias is something you can't get away with it from. It's not just in history. Every field has bias. Let me give you an example from library studies. Every once in a while in library studies, someone will do a study about how people are using resources in a library. And so they'll set up an experiment and they'll interview people and they will begin saying things like, okay, what books did you use to write this paper and how did you find the information? And then they'll put together their results. But even though that looks like a scientific experiment and looks like it should be free of bias, you're doing interviews, you're asking the same questions of everyone you're interviewing, there is bias involved. For example, depending on whether or not you're asking the questions in one library of one special population who all look, think, and have the same demographics versus whether or not you would ask the same set of questions in a library down the street that has a different demographic base skews your results.
Mm-hmm.
Then which people are more inclined to participate? I mean, because you can't necessarily ask questions of somebody who doesn't want to answer.
Right.
So are all the people who are choosing to answer the question, isn't there some amount of bias built in there because they are already predisposed to think and act in ways common to each other that those who don't want to participate in the experiment are slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got selector bias and you've got participant bias, and that's even in the field of library studies that has nothing to do with Bible or even history.
Mm-hmm.
I think to some degree, whenever one goes throughout one's life, there's bias in everything one says or does or thinks. You can eliminate it as much as you can, but you can never eliminate it completely.
Yeah, and I think if any of us approaches a person of Jesus, no matter what, and says, we're going to be absolutely neutral on this, we're just fooling ourselves. But what I tell people often in discussion is, like, you don't play the bias card until you have some real data that you can show that the person is having the bias influence the data. Because until then, I say, like, bias is just an excuse thrown out then to avoid using the data. Data is the same. People have biases. Data doesn't.
Right. Data doesn't. But depending on which data you select,
Right.
that's where the bias comes in.
Mm-hmm.
You may have, even when any author is asked to write a book, oftentimes the editors or the publishers will come back and say, this is great. We love that you've written a 200,000 word manuscript. However, nobody is going to read 200,000 words. Can you cut it down to 100,000 words?
You mean some people really don't read 200,000 words?
Well, some people read many fewer than that. There are statistics that something like the average book is only read, I forget where I saw this statistic in library science somewhere, is only read cover to cover by maybe 2 people.
Wow.
Other people will pick it up and read portions of it, or they'll read a chapter out of it, or they might read the introduction but go no further. But actually sitting down from cover to cover, I mean, other than an academic book where you have reviewers that, in theory, have to read it from cover to cover in order to complete a review, most people won't necessarily read a whole book.
Yeah, I was just throwing in some humor on my part because I could read a 200,000 page book and thoroughly enjoy it. Whenever I've gone to the library and I've used Interlibrary Loan, which is a lifeline for me there in Italian, and I'm say, now this book has to be back, and they give me a date, like about a month and a half from now. I say, really? It takes some people that long to read a book? Really?
Yes, it does. Well, but the thing is, too, being a library director, I have access to statistics on circulation.
Mm-hmm.
And it always surprised me that I'd see a book that might circulate 7, 8, or 9 times, but the book next to it on the shelf might only circulate once or twice in the same period, especially if students had a term paper to write.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would occasionally go down to the shelves and look at the shelf to see why was something circulating more than something else. And invariably, the book that was the thinner book
Yes.
would get checked out more.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it was an older book and not as current or for some other reasons, simply because it was thin and the students, of course, were, it's the night before and they've waited until last minute to write a paper, and so they were picking as many small thin resources as they could to fill up their bibliography because they didn't have time the night before to read full books.
Yeah. When you're talking about how we can look at all the data differently, This is the same because even if you have the exact same data and everyone can agree on the exact same data, the interpretation is still going to be different because people have different interests and motivations and opinions they bring to the table beforehand. I mean, when Labor Day comes around, it's a tradition that I managed to marry into, that the Habermasses, Gary and his wife, and the Laconas, Mike and his wife, get together, and now the Peters get together as well, me and my wife. And so sometimes Gary and Mike and I will go out together, sit on the back porch or something, and we'll just talk shop, which means we're talking resurrection most of the time, or something related to apologetics. And we'll, by and large, all agree on the data, but we can have vastly different ways of approaching things, and we can have three totally different opinions at the same time. And when we watch each other do debates and such, we'll critique one another in debates, say, yeah, I think you should have said this. No, I don't think that's a good argument. We have the exact same conclusion. We have pretty much the same data, and yet there are still vast differences many times.
Yes, I think that experience illustrates very well what the issue is in history. Mm. I sometimes talk to my students in New Testament introductory courses about what I flippantly call the car crash view of the Gospels. And on the blackboard, or actually they're now whiteboards these days, I draw a crossroads. And in the four corners of the crossroads, I draw different people waiting to cross the road. So at one corner, there might be a lawyer getting ready to cross the road. In another corner, there might be a woman pushing a baby carriage. Another corner might have a salesman for insurance, life insurance. And the final corner might have a college professor. And imagine they see an accident occur in the center of that crossroad. Mm-hmm. Each one of them sees the same accident, but if they're interviewed by the police who are doing a police report, they're going to say different things. Some of it is from the angle at which they were looking. If they're all, mm-hmm. if one's standing on the north corner and one is standing on the south corner, they may have seen a different detail. Like one of them may have seen a basketball roll across the intersection, but another one didn't. Then, because one is trained in insurance, one might be looking for and trained to spot details that one of the others on the corner wouldn't be looking for or trained to spot. And so their four accounts of the same incident will be quite different, even if they are interviewed by the police moments after the accident happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so why would we think history and having four Gospels would function much differently?
Yeah. In fact, when you were talking about, for instance, the mother with her stroller and such, one of the things I was thinking is, this lady might not be paying so much attention to the details of the accident, because if something's going on with that, her first priority is, my baby has to be safe, and that's what she's going to be watching, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. And so she might have caught some of the details, but might not catch other details. Mm-hmm. Or might, when the child has questions afterward, she might try to de-emphasize, if someone was, God forbid, hurt and there was blood and gore, she might try to de-emphasize that so the child won't have nightmares afterwards.
Right.
So is it any wonder that we have four different Gospels that differ and have similarities as the four different writers are recounting their experiences with Jesus to audiences that are different congregations in have different situations that need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same like people who are lectionary preachers. There are churches where everybody is given the same passage of Scripture to preach on a given Sunday.
Right.
And 5 different churches will have 5 completely different sermons on the same text.
Right.
And, that's because they're, in theory, one way to look at it is the Holy Spirit helps influence the pastors to give each particular congregation what they need to hear.
Yeah. And it's also important that because one of the things you stress out is that we can't cover everything in the field. I'm thinking about 2 different things. I've been in a conversation with someone recently talking about New Testament authorship, and he said, okay, well, first, I want to know what are your views on Adam and Eve, the flood, macroevolution, authorship of the Gospels, etc., etc., etc. I said, look, I'll give you my opinion on many of these, but in many cases, it's just my opinion. I mean, you go with the Old Testament, for instance. I think the Old Testament is extremely important. We should study it. I'll read some good books in the Old Testament, but it is not my main area of focus, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. And even when you stick to New Testament studies, Mike, for instance, has said before that if someone came to him with objections of mythicism, for instance, he'd probably hand it right over to me because I spend more time looking at that because in the scholarly world, that's just not studied as much on the internet. You kind of have to know about it. So it can seem that a lot of people think that you can just learn about everything in history immediately, and you can't.
No, you can't. I mean, you can have generalist or universal history where you, like an encyclopedia is an example of a general or a universal history because it tries to write an article that's not very in-depth about just about everything. But yet you can have a specialist history, which is a biography that deals with a single individual. And even then, you can have specialist biographies that further detail things like you could have a biography that deals with just a single year of a person's life or a single aspect of a person. Like I would imagine there is a biography somewhere out there on Princess Diana that focuses on her charitable acts and the charity she saw. That's just one small slice of her life. It's not the whole thing. And in a way, when you think about it, the gospel writers did the same thing. The 4th gospel ends with, Jesus did many other works which are not recorded in this book. And if they were all recorded, the world could not contain the works
that would be written. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I find when you're dealing with people, especially people on the internet and such, is I've recently bought a book on Kindle. I haven't started yet, but from 2 really good, reliable friends who've read it already. It's excellent. It's by a guy named Tom Nichols. I think he used to work in the intelligence department of the government and such, called The Death of Expertise. And how we live now, I think, in a world where everyone thinks that they can be an expert immediately because, hey, look, I Googled something and, hey, I read this on Wikipedia, by golly, it has to be true and such. And as someone who deals with library science, do you encounter this thing pretty often and you think it's really something we should be concerned about?
I think that even though there are a lot of people that are just taking in surface information, there are still people out there that are inclined to dig into something in depth.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at a given Wikipedia article, it is the surface encyclopedia article, but oftentimes at the base of the Wikipedia article, they do cite further sources or links out to further sources where there is more and more detail or a narrower scope of the study. And I think that eventually someone who is really, really curious will keep digging into a single subject.
I agree with that, but I think the thing is that too many people nowadays just don't do that and think that if I can look something up on Google, and if I can just stick with the internet and never have to go to a library and read any books, I can be just as informed as someone else in the field who's trained, who's specialized, who studies this stuff seriously. And to me, that just seems like a deadly mistake in research.
Well, I think it's a question of what is the difference between reading one book on a subject and reading 100 books on a subject.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And to some extent, the core in 100 books is going to be similar. You will have a lot of facts that start repeating themselves over and over itself. Again, a lot of data. But it's how the data is combined, or that last piece of data that someone else hasn't mentioned, that the specialist will have in his or her pocketbook of details that somebody who's only read one study won't have.
Yeah.
And I don't know that there's a danger in that. I think there's maybe a presumption in not understanding that that's how research works, and that assuming that if you've read one thing, you've read it all, because someone somewhere may have dug up something that no one else yet has discovered or thought about. And I think there's value in reading all that stuff just to find the nuggets.
Yeah. And when it comes to our reading, I think another great mistake that we can make if we're people who seriously study and debate and argue this stuff regularly is it's too easy, and this is for people on both sides of any debate, to read only material that agrees with you already. Someone's asked people in a debate and such as, okay, when was the last time you read an academic work on this subject, a serious academic work, that disagreed with you? I have so many people so many times say to me, well, I know this is what you believe. If you go and you just read what Bart Ehrman says, look, I read what Bart Ehrman says, okay? As soon as he has a new book out, I'm going and I'm ordering it on my Kindle immediately, so I don't have to wait a second and I can read it. I know what the other side says, and I don't think you can really consider yourself a real researcher into a position if you're not reading both sides on that position.
I agree with you completely, Nick. I think you've made a very valid point. There is informed argument where you considered and listened, and then there's, I think, bombast, where you're just arguing for the sake of arguing. The question to me is, what is the ultimate purpose of argumentation? Is argumentation to allow people to come to a compromise? Is it to allow people to convert one side to the other? Is it to allow for sensitivity to grow? Is it to allow each person to consider new things and be pushed beyond their own comfort zone? When I went to seminary, my denomination is United Methodist.
Right.
And yet I chose to attend Princeton Theological Seminary, which was Presbyterian. And a lot of people said to me, why aren't you going to a Methodist seminary? Drew is just up the street from Princeton, and Drew in, I think Madison, New Jersey, is United Methodist. Wouldn't you be more comfortable there? And it's true that there were things that I heard in classes that kind of struck me as odd. I mean, the Presbyterians would, in my theology classes would talk about this predestination thing, which I had never heard about when I was growing up, attending daily church in a Methodist church. I mean, Methodists don't talk about predestination. And so I had to actually sit down and think, well, what do I or don't I like about the idea of predestination? Why don't I like it? What do I think about that? And I grew because I had to wrestle with something that wasn't something to which I would have normally been exposed.
Right. When I was in Bible college, I remember I just went to the nearest one nearby, and it turns out it was part of a restoration movement. And I heard some views there I had never heard before in studying the Bible. And a lot of them I thoroughly disagreed with. I still do. I mean, we heard about, for instance, the whole baptismal regeneration, which for me was extremely troubling because I was at the time and still am extremely terrified of water. So I had never been baptized by immersion. I grew up more in the Methodist tradition also. So yeah, we did the sprinkler and such. And I'm just terrified of water. My wife can tell you, if you get me into a swimming pool, my logic and reason goes right out the window immediately, and I am panicking and convinced I'm about to die at any moment. But, also add in with that, I've got a steel rod strapped on my spine, so you can imagine baptism would be very hard. But at one point I decided, you know what, I think I just need to do it. And we were attending a Methodist church at the time that actually had a baptistry, a full baptistry. And I talked to my pastor, and he agreed to, and he understood I was terrified. So he said, he understood my back condition. And he said, I'm only going to take you under the bare minimum. And I did it. Which later someone asked me once, who I was kind of desobbing at the time, I said, did you feel any different after you got baptized? I said, you bet I did. I felt cold and wet. And then when I went off to seminary, my seminary at the time was premillennial dispensational. I'm an Orthodox preterist, and they said, you can attend here, just don't, be evangelizing about your views. Although a few select people knew about it. It was very interesting. I was in a class once, we had a substitute professor, and he decided he'd play eschatology Jeopardy with us and divide us into two teams. And it came out in the class that I was the all-millennial, and I was kicking tail with everyone in the class on every single question, practically. And I volunteered in the library as well, and some students would come in and talk about their research for eschatology class, not knowing my position, and they'd say, well, obviously I'm going to do my research paper on preterism. And my ears would perk up, and I'd be down and say, and I'd just ask a question, so what do you think about it? I said, well, I just don't think it can answer such and such a question. And I didn't seem to ever thinking, oh, geez, if only I could tell you, you just really don't know right now, do you? Because it can answer that question as far as I was concerned. But it is very different to get to go and be confronted with a position that is really different from one you grew up in. And some people come to me and say, well, you see, your position is the ones that you got in Bible college and seminary. I said, no, I got some positions there, but not all of them.
Exactly.
Now, I think something we could also talk about with this is, and this might seem like a simple question to so many people, but I suspect you're going to think this is a very deep question and such, and it is, what is the purpose of doing history anyway?
I think that, Nick, that's an excellent question. I think the purpose of doing history is to broaden or thicken our knowledge of the past. Mm-hmm. And I think that a reason why we do history is to learn from our mistakes and understand that the people in the past mm-hmm. who were living and walking through the corridors of history aren't really different than ourselves. Mm-hmm. Every year I take students from Duke Divinity School on trips to different Bible lands. So in 3 years, we've done Turkey to do a trip to see the churches of Revelation. We've done a trip to Israel, and this year we're doing an early Christianity trip to Rome to study things like the Roman catacombs and the prison where Paul was purportedly imprisoned when he left the shores of Palestine and ended up waiting for the emperor to hear his case. All of those sort of places are interesting, but it's more interesting that students tend to think something 2,000 years ago is slightly more primitive than our own time. And then they go and see the absolutely amazing artwork. They see glorious architecture and how complex the buildings were engineered. And they see pathways and roads and realize, goodness, the tarred road outside of my residence isn't going to last 2,000 years. Look at this wonderfully engineered Roman roadbed going through Laodicea. It's pretty amazing because my road outside my house isn't going to survive 2,000 years.
Right.
And so it helps to put context and thicken a person's understanding of what went on. One of the things I want to show my students when we hit Pompeii this year, at the trip to Italy, on one of the houses there is a mural, a fresco of someone dressed in white handing out loaves of bread. And it was often thought that this was a baker who was selling bread. And an ethno-historian who focuses on everyday details of history. And we in biblical studies don't have a lot of ethno-historians amongst our ranks. Ethno-historians are interested in the history of everyday life. Like, what does a person do from the time they get up in the morning until they go to bed? And what sort of objects do they encounter? And what is the historical significance of each of the objects? And that sort of thing. Well, anyway, this picture of the person in white, they began looking at the white toga the person was wearing. And they realized that white togas aren't everyday wear, that they're usually reserved in the Roman world for special occasions. That if you look at all the other frescoes, people are wearing, red, or they're wearing, different colors, brown, neutral greens, all these other different colors. And then they figured out that the white toga is something that is typically worn when someone is standing as a candidate for a political office. It's called the toga candida. Mm-hmm. And so you've got this white toga. And it was also typical when they began looking at bread for candidates to hand out tokens so people would remember them. It was typical to hand out bread. Mm-hmm. Well, when you think about this, seeing this portrait of this man in a white toga handing out bread, who was probably standing for candidacy for some office in Pompeii, to be a political liaison or do some sort of political job. When you think about Jesus in the Transfiguration, what color, Nick, did Jesus's robes turn when he was transfigured?
Clothes that looked as if they had been bleached white.
Yes, exactly, bleached white. And when Jesus fed the 5,000, what did he feed them?
Bread and fish.
Yes, and so would it be any difficulty knowing that historical information garnered from the portrait that is on the wall of Pompeii that you would think, it's no wonder the disciples wouldn't really understand a Messiah who was not a political Messiah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Would we understand why they would be confused? And so that history just helps to give broader context to the biblical story and what the people who might have been encountering Jesus might have been thinking.
Yeah.
That is not necessarily to say that Jesus was a politician, but that there may have been political overtones to Jesus standing up to the Roman way of doing things.
Yeah, I've told people before, when you get to Matthew 4 and you read about Jesus going about preaching the good news of a kingdom and such, I said, if you were to compare it to how society is today, you could picture Jesus going around and saying, vote for me for your Messiah.
Exactly. Except Messiah wasn't necessarily an office that people had. They voted for back then.
Right. And when you were talking about how things were so different, we think they were so primitive. One of the examples I like to dabble in every now and then, such as ancient and medieval science, because so many people look and say, look, we are so scientifically enlightened, we know so much, and they didn't back then. And it's like, look, you go back and you look at what the ancients and medievals really knew about science. They make some blunders, sure, absolutely, they sure did, but they got a lot of things right, and they got a lot of things right without the modern technology that we have today.
Right. Although I'm not so sure about that whole leeches thing.
Yeah.
But, the same thing is, 200 years from now, people are going to look back at how we tried to, cure cancer with radiation and chemo, and they're going to think, what did they do?
Yeah.
Because in 200 years, there may be a cure that's vastly more simple than what we're attempting.
Yeah, I saw something recently about some company wanted to send a couple to the moon as a prize in 2018 for a little getaway and such. And, for all we know, 100 years from now, people could be regularly making trips to the moon and think, gosh, this was a big deal for them back then.
Exactly.
Now, I think also something I'd like to, from just a kind of caveat, because you did say that when you study through, you realize they were people like us, but I also think in many ways they were like us, but they were very different from us in many ways too. On April 29th, I'm going to have Jason Georges on. He's a co-author of a book of Ministry and Honor Shame Cultures. And like I said, when I talk with Mike and Gary and such about resurrection, one of my main interests is honor shame cultures, because those are so fascinating to me, and seeing the Bible from that perspective. And I tell people in discussions, so many times you are going to read your culture in the New Testament and think people fought and lived their lives and went about their regular day-to-day thinking just like you. And they didn't. The cultures are vastly different, and if you misread the text and you read your own culture into it, you are not going to understand what's going on in the text.
Well, I think you make an excellent point. One of my favorite things to talk about my students is the fact that, here in the United States, growing up in Pennsylvania and even being here at Duke, it snows. And we associate snow with Christmas time. And so it's not weird for us to occasionally get Christmas cards where Mary and Joseph are on the donkey going through snowdrifts on their way to Bethlehem at during the Advent season.
Mm.
Yet, when you look at the climate of the Mediterranean area, the likelihood that it snowed is very minimal.
Mm-hmm.
That is not to say that it doesn't snow, but if it does snow, you're only going to have like an inch. On rare occasions, you're not going to have, great mounds that you need to plow and are going to stick around for months at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a function of folk taking their own geography and their own concept of the time period in which we celebrate Jesus' birth and imposing it on the Mediterranean region.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's quite different. I've actually been in Israel in early January one year, and it was very pleasant. I only had on a light sweater, and I was enjoying the climate very much.
It sounds wonderful to me right now here in Atlanta. It's still winter, and it can be very warm outside, and my wife and I are so different. She is very warm-natured, and I am very cold-natured, And so I was just teasing and say, isn't this weather just so wonderful? I mean, here we are in winter and it's 70 degrees outside. Just be quiet, okay, already? We are going to have a hot, awful summer. Yeah, isn't it wonderful? Now, I'd like to remind everyone, since we're around the halfway point here, that you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast. My guest right now is Beth Sheppard, and we're talking about her book, The Craft of History and the Study of the New Testament. Beth, you're here next week. Well, we've talked about him several times already this episode. He's coming on the show again. One of our favorite guests, my father-in-law, Mike Lacona, is going to be our guest next week. And he's going to be talking about his latest book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? We talked a little bit about Plutarch research back in 2014 when I interviewed him, but he's going to come back again, and we're going to be talking about his newest book out there. So if you're interested in that, tune in next week. For now, let's get back to Dr. Sheppard talking about the craft of history and the study of the New Testament. Now, unfortunately, historians, like anyone else, can make mistakes, believe it or not. And I remember years ago reading the book Historical Fallacies by Fisher, David Fisher, I think it was. What are some of the mistakes that you think historians are most prone to make, especially when it comes to studying the historical Jesus?
I think that one of the biggest mistakes that is easiest to make is anachronism. Get the wrong time period and the wrong time frame to apply to Jesus or Jesus's time. One of the things that I've often wondered is I'll go to a site with my students, like Sepphoris, which is just a few miles away from Nazareth. And it's very likely, indeed, that Jesus traveled to Sepphoris, or sometimes they call it Zippori, and there's a theater there. And I once listened to a tour guide talk about how it might have been possible that Jesus watched plays or events in this one particular theater. Yet the theater wasn't built until likely the late 1st, early 2nd century. So it wasn't built during Jesus' lifetime. And so that kind of a slight, not quite knowing the date and the sequence when things actually happened would be a problem in history that is an instance of anachronism.
Yeah, I remember. I'm also thinking right now about how there are some things that I just want to check the basic facts on. I've actually recently come across one of the strangest arguments I've come across in debating with someone about their explanation of a historical Jesus who doesn't believe in the resurrection. He said, oh, it's pretty simple. The disciples use the poison of a pufferfish in order to fake Jesus' death, and then it's pretty much the swoon theory from there. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, I can't believe I'm hearing that. And my wife, when I told her that, just because I was like, honey, you won't believe what I just heard. And she asked the very first question that I would have wanted to ask her and said, do they even have those in that area?
Exactly.
And
yeah. I don't know. I have not studied the fish of the region.
Well, when I looked, I didn't find any mention of there, and I'm also thinking that there was one person who wrote something about the Gospel of Luke in the end with the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and how he said, and this could have been meant to give, this could have been meant to give an idea later on of, for instance, that all roads lead to Rome. Well, that could make sense until you realize all roads lead to Rome wasn't a saying back then. And then it suddenly changes.
Right. So, I mean, people can make all sorts of different mistakes in history. It's just, part of what is I'm sorry. My mind is skittering here. I was traveling late last night, and my plane was delayed and only arrived at the airport 2 hours late. But you can actually even have problems with project design. How did you? When I spoke about the experiment in the library, how I set up, how one would set up investigating whether or not people read a certain type of book. If you're only asking a certain audience and not asking other audiences what they read, have you designed your experiment incorrectly? You can actually ask questions of history that don't necessarily make sense. Let me see if I can think of a possible example. One might look at the historical Jesus and ask, for instance, what Jesus thought of microwaves. Well, he would not have encountered a microwave. That trying to figure out and write an entire book on Jesus's views of microwaves is a project that is probably doomed to failure, simply because you're asking a question that is unanswerable. Whether or not Jesus had foreknowledge of microwaves, because as the Gospel of John tells us, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and may have knowledge of things that a normal human being would know, and whether or not he ever, as a historical figure, encountered a microwave are two different things.
Yeah. One thing I was saying we could go, to use another example, we could have someone who's trying to exegete text and say, what did Jesus think of, say, a vegan lifestyle? And say, well, whatever Jesus said, that probably wasn't first and foremost on his mind. And if you take that kind of question and try and make an argument that this is what the historical Jesus thought about this, you're likely going to have some trouble, because that wasn't an issue people were talking about then.
Correct. Exactly. I mean, I don't think vegetarianism or veganism, even the diet, they may not have had the option to have a diet that would be a total vegan diet in that time period. Josephus actually talks about the valley of the cheesemakers at the time of the Jewish war in Jerusalem. So clearly people were buying and selling and making cheese as part of a diet staple.
Something that occurred to me also about how we're doing history is one of the most common objections I get, and this is, I think, another example of anachronism, is when we say, well, look, you have this guy going around, he's doing all these great miracles and such, and no one thinks to write it down until decades later. Why wouldn't everyone just do that immediately? And I'll go and say, look, here's what I recommend you consider here. In the ancient world, you'd have two different ways of spreading a message. You could write it down, or you could use word of mouth. Word of mouth is free. It's more reliable. The stories are told in groups. Everyone can tell the story. Everyone who understands the language can tell a story, and it's done instantly. Writing is expensive. It's timely. It reaches fewer people. You have to be able to read to understand writing. If you can't read, you have to depend on someone who can read. And like I said, it costs a lot of money. Which one do you think you're going to use to spread the message?
Right. I mean, when we, again, look at library science, most people do tend to learn more information by hearing it than by actually reading it. When you think about your everyday life, you may be listening to the radio as you drive to work. You may be listening to conversation around the water cooler, you may be hearing way more information than you're actually taking in by reading.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that people in the ancient world didn't read.
Right.
We're beginning to think, with all of the various graffiti that we've discovered in ancient cities, that at least at some rudimentary level, lots of folk had at least some knowledge of reading. There's a good article on this, or a chapter in a book by Craig Evans.
Yep.
And he does a chapter in his book, and I can't
Jesus and the Remains of His Day.
Yes, that's it. Thank you for. He has a great chapter on the question of, did Jesus read or not? And he looks not only at biblical passages that seem to reference Jesus reading in the temple, or perhaps writing something down on the ground, but he also looks at ancient inscriptions and how many statues have people's names carved in them, and information and dedications. And someone moving throughout the ancient world, throughout an ancient city, was encountering text all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you all can't see this, unfortunately. I see Dr. Sheppard's webcam here. I hope Tom sees what she's going, and it looks like she's looking back on, I'm thinking, a kitchen counter, and it's got books there, and trying to see if books back there. But I'll tell you, if you are interested in Jesus and the Remains of His Day, go to July 16th of last year. We interviewed Craig Evans on that book here. So if you want some more information about that, then yes, that is the place to go. But it still is just this whole anachronistic approach that people go into. And I like what you said about how we learn a lot more about hearing, because one of the things I follow in media is that if I'm out somewhere and I hear someone tell a joke, for instance, and I really like it, I don't have to hear them tell me that joke 5 or 6 times to understand. I can go and tell it to someone else. Now, chances are it won't be verbatim, word for word, which is also usually another mistake, because we think things have to be memorized word for word when we read the Gospels, but it will be the same joke still.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And, that I did just bring up, I do think it is another mistake we make, that we live in an age where you can record what someone says, you can make a transcript of it. We could make a transcript of this show if we want to, for instance, and everything would be word for word. And so we go back to the Gospels, like, by God, we have to have the very exact words Jesus spoke. And we won't. But we can say we do have the words Jesus spoke.
Yeah, but even if you have the words that Jesus spoke, you don't necessarily have the historical Jesus.
Right.
I mean, there is the narrative. I mean, having a transcript of events is not history. It's the evidence that is used for a history.
Mm-hmm.
You, Nick, are way more than just your words, your facial expressions and what you're thinking and what causes you to do and think what you're doing, and what causes you to even have this show. That's all part of who you are, beyond just what you happen to say or what might be recorded in one of these sessions that somebody would take down as a transcript.
Right.
And that's the thing about the historical Jesus, is there is so much to learn, and there's so much more to learn. My concern always is that by focusing so much, as historians of the Bible tend to do, on the words and actions, we're missing. They worry about, did this miracle happen or didn't that miracle happen? Or in the Jesus seminar, did Jesus say exactly these words when you're comparing the synoptics? The one gospel author will have the quote a little differently than another gospel author. What exactly was Jesus' word? And I think by focusing down on all of that, you're missing questions like, what was Jesus' economic status?
Mm-hmm.
how much money did Jesus or Jesus' family actually have? Personally, I'm not entirely certain when someone is called to register for a census, as Jesus was, as Jesus's family was, that the Romans would have been particularly interested in registering those who were destitute, because the whole point of census is to be able to ultimately collect taxes. Mm-hmm. And so was Jesus' family very poor or destitute, or did they have some means? Mm-hmm. And so I think a good study of the tax system and the purpose of a census and the economy of the ancient world would go very far to helping us understand Jesus. And then looking in the text of what kind of stuff did he and the disciples actually seem to own.
Yeah.
I mean, and
they had a treasurer, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question is, how much did a sword cost in the ancient world so that one of them could lop off an ear at Jesus's arrest?
Yeah.
And how much did cloaks cost? And all those sort of sandals. How much did sandals cost? And all of those things could come together to form an economic history of Jesus.
Yeah.
Beyond his words and miracles.
Something else I was thinking about his words and such is that it goes back to the cultural thing. One of the things I like to tell people is that the ancient world of Israel was what we call a high context society, where a huge amount of background knowledge about day-to-day matters and such was already assumed. And we live in a low context society where if you hear a news report about some country, you have to be told something in the report about what this country is, because most people who are watching won't know. And so when you read the New Testament, especially the epistles of Paul, there's a whole lot of background knowledge that's sitting there. People say, why wasn't this brought up? Why wasn't this brought up? And it's not brought up. I mean, Paul doesn't say as much about historical Jesus, for instance, because he's already been to a lot of these churches. They already believe in Christianity. They already know about the historical Jesus. They don't need to hear all this again. And we could say in some ways the same thing happens today. I could be out somewhere with my wife. I mean, let's suppose, for instance, hypothetically, that you and your husband met with my wife and I. I could say something to her taper, and she would just bust out laughing, and you two could be watching and saying, did we miss something? What happened? Because like many couples, we have some inside terms that are great jokes for us that will make us laugh inevitably. That's just part of the way it is. So even if we have the words, again, there's a whole lot of background knowledge that we need to have as well.
Exactly.
I did like talking about the whole economics of Jesus, too. Although we have to be careful, because as we can tell, there are people who will go the whole way and make things very extreme. I've heard those word of faith teachers, for instance, say, you've seen Jesus' clothes. Jesus was wearing the designer clothes of his day. He was living a life of wealth and luxury and such. And yet, then you can also look at Jesus as, foxes have holes and birds have nests. Son of Man has no place to lay his head.
Right, but on the other hand, the disciples who were fishermen seemed to have boats and nets and stuff. I don't think necessarily that they were the highest class, but again, I don't think they were destitute. If you think about it, any movement in history, those who don't have resources at all aren't necessarily going to be the movers and shakers who go against the establishment. I think it's those who have some modest means at least can start to make a difference because they're not worried about. If you're limited about worrying about where your next meal is coming from, you're going to be focused on that. If you a little comfortable and you don't have to necessarily worry too much about what's in your refrigerator. You can start worrying about things beyond your immediate needs. And I think that's where we want to situate the disciples and Jesus as someone who at least had enough to get by and could start looking, picking up their heads and looking at the world around them instead of just focusing on their own immediate problems.
Yeah, well, before we go further at that time, I think I'm going to just go ahead and let people know that you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast, as I said earlier, and everything we do here is listener supported. And we could really use your support. Seriously, we could. Go to my website if you want to, deeperwatersapologetics.com. There's a place on the side that says Help Support the Work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries. And there's a link in there. You click on that, it takes you to Risen Jesus. As you've heard from the show, that's the ministry of my in-laws, Mike and Debbie Lacona. You make a donation, and then you get in touch with me or Audi or Mike or Debbie and say, hey, I made a donation. I want to go to Nick Peters. I want to go to Deeper Waters. They will make sure we get that donation. It will be tax deductible. You can also support us by buying some ebooks on Amazon. Some I've written. Well, one I've written, Creed for the Ages, the Apostles' Creed in Today's Christians. And some I've co-written, such as Defining Inerrancy, or Ground Us, or God in Natural Disasters. And there's another way you can support us as well, and that's by buying jewelry. And since I've got Dr. Sheppard on here, I think she could probably assure me that for the most part, women love getting jewelry, don't they?
Well, I know I do.
Yeah. And guys, if you got that special lady in your life, maybe your wife, your girlfriend, maybe your mother or daughter, for instance, and you want to get her some jewelry, do it through us. Go to Premier Jewelers. The access code is LOVE. My friend Lena Cluster runs it. If you need some help, get in touch with me. I'll do what I can to help you out. Whatever you buy for that lady in your life, we will get 25% of that purchase, whatever it is. So guys, I mean, if you're married, like I always say, you can buy something for your wife to make up for that screw up that you did recently, or you can buy something to make up for that screw up that I know you're going to make in the future. Yes, you will, and yes, I see you laughing there, Dr. Sheppard. I think you know this very well.
I don't know. Let's not talk about mistakes in the marriages.
Yeah, unfortunately, we all make them. Dr. Sheppard, do you have an organization or charity you'd like to see people donate to?
Oh, yes, I am a faculty member at Duke Divinity School, and I do want to encourage all your listeners to think about supporting the local School of Theology or schools of theology of their particular denomination, or even a School of Theology of which they are aware. Because students today going into the ministry, going into clergy professions do not get paid very well. Mm-hmm. And education is expensive, sadly. And we don't want our seminary graduates being so strapped with debt that they can't minister effectively because they're paralyzed by heavy burdens. So do think of supporting your favorite School of Theology by sending some money their way, so that students can defer the cost of theological education.
Yeah, I can assure people, if you think many of us who do ministry are in it for the money, we are not. If we wanted to make a lot of money, we would be in a whole other field. Sorry, but Joel Osteen just doesn't represent most of us out there. Now, when we were talking about the disciples just now, I think one of the things that, about their economic success, made me think of it another way, because you talk about them being fishermen, and so a lot of people can say about the disciples, like, well, see, his disciples were these poor, ignorant fishermen who didn't have any learning whatsoever. And hey, you know what? That's even in the Bible, because it says that these people, in Acts it says, they are not educated. So see, his disciples were obviously just very foolish, gullible people, didn't understand the world. And so why should we take them seriously? And that's just as much a bad reading, isn't it?
I think it is. One of the things that always troubled me when I was at school is I heard this theory that the disciples were not at all educated.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, I wonder sometimes, what is wrong with adult education? If you are a disciple and you encounter and learn from Jesus, who went by they called him rabbi, which is teacher, if you're learning and spending time following Jesus, and you realize how important the event was after the resurrection and Pentecost, mightn't you wish to gain a little bit of skill in writing? Or might you not wish to use a scribe or amanuensis to record some of the stories of your own encounters of Jesus? We know even Paul, in some of his letters, will close a letter with, I write this in my own hand, implying that he had dictated most of the letter and then was picking up the pen and writing a note by himself, but that he probably had a scribe assisting him. Mm-hmm. So why would we think that just because someone might not have a certain level of literacy at one point, they couldn't gain it later, or they couldn't have access to somebody who would be literate on their behalf?
Yeah. When this comes up, it's often put in the talk of science, for instance, in the ancient world, and trying to contrast it today. I mean, for instance, today, like many Christians, I do affirm the virgin birth, and yet you have so many people who say, well, you know what? We know today that virgins don't give birth, or we know that dead people stay dead. And I'm just like I'm saying, look, if you want to make this as your argument, then please tell me, when did modern science establish all of these things and make these great discoveries? Because back then, Joseph wanted to divorce Mary at the time because he knew exactly what it took to make a baby. And when people died back then, they actually buried them because they knew just as well as we do that dead people do stay dead. I mean, sure, these people didn't know modern science. They didn't know all about death like we do. But they sure knew enough knowledge to know that dead people stay dead.
Well, you know, that in Christianity, that might be the case, Nick. But in the ancient Roman world, there was actually a day that was a festival set aside. I think it was in the month of May, where they worried about the ghosts of the unburied dead infecting Roman houses. Mm-hmm. They would have a ceremony where they would clang cymbals and throw beans over their shoulders and try to chase the dead out of their homes, which is why we have the legends sometimes that marriages in May are unlucky marriages. It comes from those pagan ceremonies and rites. Mm. Christians were, however, in the Jewish mode of tradition. When you think about it, Jesus read in the temple. He attended Jewish festivals. He would travel from Jerusalem, from the Galilee region down to Jerusalem, and he would worship in the temple. So he was Jewish, and a lot of the burial practices and burial customs with which he would have, and the disciples would have been familiar, would have been those of Judaism. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can understand concern about ghosts. I mean, I think even in Judaism they sometimes had that, but I think there's also, to be fair, a difference between saying that someone's spirit might come and such, to saying someone's whole body might come right out of that tomb. they knew back then. They knew back then that didn't happen. I mean, it's not like we've discovered so much in modern science that now we know those miracles couldn't happen, and those poor, ignorant, stupid people back then didn't know that.
Yeah, the interesting thing about like the Lazarus story is not just the miracle itself, but I always find what is very interesting is the knowing the history of ancient rules for cleanliness and purification. Mm-hmm. Lazarus was declared dead. He comes back from the dead, and even though one would become impure or defile themselves by corpse impurity, Jesus tells everybody, Lazarus' relatives to go and unbind him, to touch the formerly dead corpse, and they would, in theory, have corpse impurity. And then a few days later, if you're looking at the gospel and reading the time sequence, suddenly Jesus is in the home having a meal with Lazarus. Mm-hmm. So that tells you something about Jesus' view of the rules about cleanliness and uncleanliness, and there might be something we can take away from that. Jesus was not afraid to eat with sinners, but he's also not afraid to eat with those who are designated unclean.
Yeah, I think something else good to add to that is that back in the Jewish belief system, it was also believed that the soul of a person would stay around the corpse for 3 days and then realize, well, this is a lost cause, and go off on its way. Lazarus was resurrected on the 4th day. I think there's a reason for that.
Yeah, and I think knowing all those historical details and reflecting on them help to inform and understand the stories and the points that are being made about the events in the past. They help modern historians interpret what is going on. And I think that's all good and worthwhile.
You have a subsection also on biographies, and it's pretty much the near consensus in most New Testament scholars that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. And I think this is another case where we can read anachronisms into a text, because so often we're looking to say, well, why don't we hear anything more about Jesus' childhood? And then you hear all these stories. Jesus went to India when he was a child and then came back and such. And I typically look, you go and read Plutarch's biographies or any other biographies, there's very little about a person's childhood, because we might be interested in that today. It doesn't mean they were.
Right. It isn't necessarily just biographies. Mm. When you think also about a different type of literature, which are the orations of praise and blame, mm-hmm. the panegyrics, mm-hmm. Those were often when somebody took office, like when the emperor took office, there would be a speech in the emperor's honor, and it would highlight special aspects of a person's career. And often the childhood event is brushed over or not focused on very much. Mm-hmm. They would more focus on the political and military feats that an mm-hmm. individual would accomplish. Mm-hmm. There's a very light hand of anything from a person's youth that would be covered. And so I'm not entirely certain when one looks beyond the biographies to the panegyrics, which are these speeches that are done in honor of someone for special occasions, that one doesn't also see something that might look very similar to the Gospels in a way.
Yeah, isn't it then another case of anachronism then when we approach the Gospels and we hear about biographies and we think biographies means modern biographies, and Greco-Roman ones weren't that. We can often say a biography has to be chronological. Theirs weren't always chronological.
Yeah, correct. And I think that the book you're going to discuss next week is probably the best one I've read in quite some time about showing some of the features of Greco-Roman biography and its peculiarities, because it studies one particular author and how the same event might be recorded slightly differently, even from the point of one author. That I think is a very helpful thing, and I'm looking forward to tuning in when that show is available, so that I can hear. I enjoyed reading that book on Plutarch and biography very much, Mike's, and would be curious to hear what he has to say. Get the story from the horse's mouth, as it were.
Well, I'll make sure to pass on your praise to him. When I talk about differences in the Gospels and such, one analogy I often use is that suppose Ali and I are sitting here together, and maybe we're playing a game or watching a show or doing whatever, and there's a knock on the door, and I open it, and here are some Jehovah's Witnesses. So internally I start salivating and such. I was like, oh boy, Christmas has come early. And I was like, come on in. I'd love to talk to you about the Bible. And so we come in, and I have a talk with them, and usually before too long they realize, oh my gosh, we've made a big mistake coming here. And then I'll call people afterwards, just let them know how it went. And I suppose there are two kinds of people I'll call. I'll call my parents, and then I'll call her parents. Now, my parents, they're Christians also, but they're not as theologically in-depth and historically in-depth as my in-laws are. So I'll tell them what I said, but it's kind of going to be a minimum version. Now, when I call Mike and tell him, I'm going to go way more in-depth because he understands a lot more of the in-depth issues. It's still essentially the same story, but the different audiences and such change the story. But no one's being told a lie, and sometimes the details might get mixed up, sometimes they might be omitted and such, but it's still the same story.
Correct. I mean, in a way, the passages I always think about are the Pauline passages, which talk about giving children milk and then weaning them off of milk and then bringing them onto meat. I think we do that naturally. People are at different places in their life, and we need to meet them where they are and help them handle the amount of information and the type of information where they're at, and then take them on the road to the next stage. I mean, even in basic theological education, we don't necessarily start with an in-depth look at the book of Revelation. We start in our curriculum with a general introduction to the New Testament. And we only get into what we call the book courses, or a detailed analysis, when they have basic background about the New Testament as a whole, that prepares them for the in-depth look.
Something that surprised me about your book also was the kind of ways that you thought history could be informed. I've got my ministry partner likes to read, I think his name is Turtle Dove, with hypothetical historical situations, like, say, for instance, with Charles Lindbergh had been elected president, and he was much more open to the Nazis, and we would have liked. Could the U.S. have been part of the Axis forces in that case instead of the Allies and such? And I look at it and think, well, that's kind of cute and such, but I think you look and say, we could actually learn something about history by doing that.
Yes, Nick. What I'm talking about are parallel histories or imaginative histories. I don't want to too often much use the phrase alternate history, because alternate history is a particular genre of science fiction. But when a biblical scholar engages in imagining the past and trying to write out maybe a fiction story set in the past, then that Bible scholar is forced to think about details and think about things that they might not ordinarily study. So, for example, there is a book by Bruce Longenecker called The Lost Letters of Pergamum, which it came out in, I don't remember the original date, 2003 or so, but it's been re-released or in a second edition recently, 2016. He actually talks about finding a hypothetical cache of letters in Pergamum that ends up being a delightful exploration of what would basic life be like for a Christian living under the empire and then ultimately facing Christian persecution. And as he writes the letter, there are these hypothetical fake fiction letters. He's actually, as a biblical scholar, investigating things like what is the government like in the ancient world in Pergamum? What are the gladiatorial games? Who puts on a gladiatorial game, and how do you logistically arrange one of those to happen? And so all of the historical research that is being done there helps inform and add information that he can then go back and apply to the first century Christian world and to even the early Christian martyrs and something like the book of Revelation, which talks about martyrdom. So this fiction book, even though it's an imagined history, can help a biblical scholar think of new questions to investigate in a more pure historical mode.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this and thinking, if a lot of people don't really want to sit down and read an academic tome, but if they read some like historical fiction that is a fake story, but it's set in a true historical context, they could learn a whole lot about history. One of the books I got on my shelf, for instance, is, I can't think of the author right now, but it's A Week in the Life of a Roman Centurion, and it ends up being about the centurion who had a servant who he asked Jesus to heal him, and you go through, and it's a great story, and at the same time, you learn a lot about history, and sadly, of course, this can work both ways. Unfortunately, a lot of people read the Da Vinci Code and thought they were learning a lot about history. They weren't, but fiction can have that kind of power.
Yes, it can. The thing I actually like about Bruce Longenecker's work is at the back, he actually has a guide or a glossary. What did he make up and what was factual in each letter to help someone who enjoyed reading it sort out the fictional strands from the actual history that was researched for it. So that was a helpful guide. But yes, you can learn a lot, and I think instead of having just novelists writing those sort of histories, I think the world could do with some biblical scholars writing a few more than are currently out there and available for us to read.
Yeah, I think a lot of problems is at something we get into the big intellectual thing, we tend to put aside fiction for a time and say, we want to be interested in the real world. Strangely, though, we seem to have no problem watching movies and television shows that are entirely fictional and such, but when it comes to books, no, those have to be real.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, again, the issue of accessibility. What is easier for people, and meeting people where they're at? Is it easier for a group of first-year students in seminary to read the fictional letters created by Bruce Longenecker to understand the ancient world? Or is it easier for them to dive into a big history that has a lot of footnotes that they have to wade through? And I think using history as an entryway or a starting point or fiction as an entryway or a starting point is not a bad idea at all.
Yeah, it really does also depend on the level of book reading. I mean, we've talked about Mike's book, For instance, let's go back to the one about the resurrection of Jesus. If I was teaching a class on apologetics at my local church, for instance, I'm not going to go to them locally and say, okay, I want you all to read this book, and we're going to read a chapter once a month and discuss it, because a lot of them will pick it up and say, oh my gosh, I am lost already. Now, I could say, we're going to be talking about the resurrection. I want you to get Gary Habermas and Michael Konas a case for the resurrection of Jesus, which is much more reader-friendly and such in that sense, and say, now we're going to go through this and we're going to discuss this together. Or we could even say, go and pick up a copy of The Case for Christ, and we're going to go through that together. And this will help people who aren't academics, but who still do want to learn about the historical Jesus or anything else for that matter.
Well, I think you've hit on a very interesting point, Nick, in that when we write books, one of the things that the publisher asks us is, who is your intended audience? Are you intending your audience to be high-level academics? Or are you intending them to be someone who is just interested in the subject and a casual church attendee who wants to learn just a little bit more? And once you have in mind who it is for which you're writing, when you're writing, you think about, okay, maybe I won't use the $50 word that is the specialty vocabulary word in my field. Maybe instead I will use plain, ordinary language so that someone doesn't need to read sitting there with a dictionary. I sometimes tell people in my classes about the experience I had when I was my husband and I were buying our first house. We were going through one house, looking as a potential buying it, and there was something wrong with the closets. The closet doors didn't hang quite right, or it was something that would have been easily fixed with just adjusting the hinges on the closet door. And I looked at this poor realtor, and I said, oh, I'm not worried about the closet door. That's adiaphora. And adiaphora was a word that I had learned in a seminary church history class when we were talking about the creeds. And it's a technical word that means essentially interesting but not necessary. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a fancy word for that. And it didn't occur to me until we left that house that very likely the word adiaphora was not in the vocabulary of the realtor.
It wasn't in my vocabulary.
and so when an author is writing for an audience and has the audience in mind, one chooses one's words very carefully so that they're clear and accessible. And you've given an excellent example of some books are written for an audience that is immersed in the subject, and some are written for audiences that are coming to the subject for the first time. And they're very different types of prose when you're writing.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about history so far and the study of the past. And from your knowledge, here's an interesting way you can put it. What do you think the future of history is going to be from here?
Are you asking particularly about New Testament history or history in general?
Well, let's start with history in general, and maybe we can broaden it down to New Testament then.
I don't think history as a field is ever going to go away. Right. Every once in a while there are challenges to history, but history is something that people are interested in. It's something that's important because I do think we have to learn from our mistakes. What I do think the next phase of history is going to be is a switch from history being in the text to history being multimedia. And you already see this with the History Channel. Mm-hmm. I think the interesting thing that is coming down the pike is that now I'm going to put on my big futuristic hat and start imagining what the future. I'm going to be the prophetess Beth Sheppard here for the moment.
We got the stones ready in case you make a mistake.
Okay. Yeah, you collect those stones. But already we see, for example, students that cannot read cursive writing.
Uh-huh.
Because cursive often is not taught in elementary schools anymore the way it used to be.
Mm.
And so I encounter even students in my library when I have them when we have scanned digitized items, say a collection of 20th century, early 20th century letters that I want them to create transcripts for so that they're searchable in the library databases by word searches, because the software can't read cursive, but it can read a typed transcript. Mm-hmm. And I find that most of the students anymore, it's very hard to find one who can read and understand cursive.
Mm-hmm.
They can sign their names in cursive, but they can't necessarily read or write cursive on their own.
Mm.
Eventually, as we move into things like Alexa,
mm-hmm.
we move into voice-activated computers, I think history will no longer be something you read, but it might be something to which you listen or something you watch.
Yeah, I'm so glad I had my headphones on. Now, when you mentioned the name of the tap figure, because if I hadn't, I would have been hearing that beep immediately in the back, asking what I could do for him. We've got a tap here. I love it, but you can't just say the name, because if we just say it in conversation, it goes off immediately. But yeah, it is becoming something we watch, and more presentations are having to be PowerPoint, for instance, as well. Exactly.
So I think the question is, history will not necessarily. The big thing is not that history won't be done, but what format will it be done in? And I don't think it will be done necessarily in books as we know them anymore. I think it will move more and more toward multimedia.
Do you even actually see an age where maybe the book would be a relic of the past?
I think. Now again, I'm spouting what may be for some of my colleagues heresy. I talked to.
Oh, I'm starting to have nightmares already.
Oh, nightmares already. Well, I'm sorry, but I actually have a colleague here on campus who is in the business library. So she directs the business library, like I direct the divinity library here at Duke. And we had an interesting conversation last week, or maybe it was the week before, about the fact that many business students now are taking out and circulating audiobooks rather than print.
Right.
And when I talk to my colleagues in Bible, they say, but what about the footnotes? How can you get footnotes? And, well, it's great to talk about footnotes, but what happens when students rely so much on audiobooks, rely so much on voice-activated technology that students are admitted to seminaries and Bible schools who can't read anymore. Mm-hmm. They're not expected to in school, just like they're not expected to learn and have command of cursive. And I think within 20 or 25 years, students will be coming to the steps and doors of higher education, theological education, without the ability to read.
Oh my gosh, I think my blood just ran cold at that point, especially even at a time where even more people aren't reading books. I'm sorry, that's just scary for me to think about.
Well, it is, but every once in a while, I don't own a TV, and I don't subscribe to a newspaper, but I will click on news on the internet. I've got a news feed that I'm particularly interested in business news, and science news, which is what I tend to read a lot. But even so, 3/4 of the news stories are actually video clips.
Mm-hmm.
And I get frustrated by them because it takes me less time to read a news story than it does to wait for the advertisement to spool through.
Oh, yes.
And then actually sit through the news story than it does to actually read it. Reading for me is much quicker.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, there must be a fair amount of demand for the video-only news feeds because sometimes it's harder and harder for me to find a text-based news story.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Sheppard, we've had a good discussion here. Ended on a very frightening note. Hopefully, that can be an alarm to people say, hey, we have to do something. We have to change the future now. Yeah, everyone put on your fashion. We're going to try and change the future here. I would like to thank you for coming on, though. Do you have a blog or website where people can get in touch with you if you want to find out more?
I don't actually have a blog or website, but folk could always be more than welcome to email me at my address at school. It's Beth.Sheppard, spelled SHEPPARD, at div.duke.edu, and I'd be happy to correspond with folk if they have more questions about history and the New Testament, and I look forward to hearing from people, and thank you so much, Nick, for inviting me on the show. It was a blast. I've not done a podcast format before. You've made it very simple, and I wish you all the best.
Well, it was a lot of fun. It's great to talk to someone who has a great love of books as well, and is familiar with libraries. And if you all want to get familiar with Dr. Sheppard's book, The Craft of History and the Study of the New Testament, I'm doing a check right now. At the time of this recording, the paperback is $32.95. The hardcover is $47.95. No Kindle version at this point. Maybe that's coming out in the future and such. Dr. Sheppard, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with the Deeper Waters audience?
Well, the only final thought I have to offer is bless you. Bless you for listening. Bless you for thinking and wanting to learn more about the historical Jesus, and bless you on your own faith journey. I wish you all the best.
Well, I'd like to thank you for coming on, and hopefully we'll see you back here again sometime.
Alrighty. Thank you.
I'd like to remind everyone that next week, Mike Lacona is coming on. We're talking about his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? For now, I am Nick Peters, and I am signing off.